Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webcast, Getting Started with DriveWorksXpress. I'm the moderator, Krista Prokos. Before we get started, I want to let you know that you can submit questions for today's presenter by typing them into the Q&A panel at any time. We'll collect them and address them at the end of the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce our presenter. We're happy to have with us today Adam Castaneda, an application engineer at Fisher Unitech. Adam, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webcast on getting started with DriveWorksXpress. So to start off, I'd like to tell you a bit about myself. So I've been with Fisher a little over a year now, but aside from that, I do have roughly 3 years of engineering experience, ranging from simple drafting to product design and designing for manufacturability. I started using SolidWorks about 6 years now, so I have had a few years of experience using it. And since my beginnings with SolidWorks, I have received a couple certifications. Some more of the noteworthy ones I've shown on here, but I am a SolidWorks certified expert, in addition to a couple more drawing, sheet metal, weldments, and surfacing, just to name a few. So an agenda for what we're going to cover today. First, we'll start off with what exactly is DriveWorks. Then we'll go ahead and talk about the resources and activation help for DriveWorksXpress specifically, since that is the main topic for this webinar. I'll go into how DriveWorksXpress works and talk to you a bit about an associate certification that's available to anyone that has access to SolidWorks and DriveWorksXpress. I'll go ahead and do a live demo for you, talk about some of the services that Fisher offers in regard to DriveWorks, and then we'll round it out with our Q&A session. So I guess the main question here is, what is DriveWorks? For those of you who are not familiar with it, in a nutshell, it's essentially a suite of software that's used as a design, automation, and sales configuration. See, I'm seeing a few people are having some issues hearing me. Is that just for them or someone else having that issue as well?
We can hear you fine. I'll see if I can help them.
Okay, great. Just wanted to double check here. Yeah, they may just have to sign in or call in, but I'll go ahead and continue here. So from here, we will go ahead and talk about the 3 products that DriveWorks offers. So there's essentially, from the beginning, you have DriveWorksXpress, and so this is kind of the entry-level design automation software that we'll be talking about today. From there, you can move up to DriveWorks Solo, and DriveWorks Solo essentially adds a bit more functionality to the software, so you're able to do more drawing control and have a little more advanced control of your model. And you are able to get a free 30-day trial of Solo. From there, the most powerful software is DriveWorks Pro, and this essentially allows you to create an online sales generating operating system. So you'll be able to create a custom configurator that you can run on the web on pretty much any device anywhere. But of course, for the purpose of this presentation, we'll actually be focusing more on the DriveWorksXpress portion of this. But before then, I would like to actually show you a kind of what the Pro software is capable of. So Warner is a Fisher customer, and they have implemented an online configurator for their WeatherGuard product. So I'll go ahead and share what that looks like. So here is their website and their van configurator. I would like to note that this entire interface you see here is completely run by DriveWorks, DriveWorks Pro specifically. So from here, for example, I can go ahead and choose my van model. And I do have a couple options here depending on the wheelbase and what type of roof I have. So I can go ahead and select one of those and continue from there. And what you'll see here is that DriveWorks Pro actually goes ahead and it generates an entire model of an empty van, depending on what configuration you chose. And they do have some initial packages you could choose from. So selecting the general package here, I'll go ahead and add that package. And you'll see it generate in 3D, showing you exactly how that would look within the van. And it does keep track of how much space you have available. So depending on what type of configuration you choose, you can add some more components or remove them and keep track of how much space you have left so that you don't overextend and maybe have too many components in your van. But from there, you can see here, I can add more components, but since I chose a pre-existing configuration, I'll go ahead and just continue with this one. Here's an additional option for roof rack. So for example, if I chose this Easy Glide 2 roof rack, you'll see it generate and also get added to the assembly once I insert the roof rack here. So this is to kind of give you a good idea as to what this software is capable of. So this is the DriveWorks Pro, pretty much working on a completely online interface. And something that's neat on here as well is that it also handles any sort of Google Maps interface here. So just entering my zip code, I'm able to find essentially which type of distributors I can find and go from there. So I'd be able to contact them and kind of get this order going. But we'll go ahead and hop back onto here because our main focus, of course, is DriveWorksXpress. And this is essentially again, the starter or edition of DriveWorks, and it's more for a single engineer to kind of automate his job. So a couple of resources and activation help that we have available on our website. You can go ahead and go to fisherunitech.com/DriveWorksXpress. And as you can see here, we do have a step-by-step activation. So if you guys haven't activated yet, I know quite a few of you have, but if you haven't and you were interested in going ahead and activating it to try it out, you would essentially just go to this website and follow those instructions. And then additionally, near the bottom, you do have a couple more tabs, such as product details, videos, data sheets, and resources. Under that videos tab, we do have a few videos that are essentially a kind of tutorial or training for DriveWorksXpress. If you go through these videos, you'll essentially be able to do what you see me do later in the demo, and you'll have pretty much a good foundation to start off of from there. So how exactly does DriveWorksXpress work? Initially, you have to set up a project in DriveWorksXpress, and this is all done internally within SolidWorks itself. It's an add-on for SolidWorks. Once you set up that project, you have to go ahead and capture dimensions and features within the model that you want to drive. So if there's any sort of dimension, maybe a length dimension that I anticipate having to change, I would go ahead and capture that dimension. And if there's features that I may or may not want to have, depending on that variation, I would capture the feature itself. From there, I can also add custom properties or drawings that I want to control as well. The next step would be to create an input form. And on this form, you can essentially have text boxes, you can have drop-down lists, you can have sort of check boxes to fine-tune exactly what kind of information you're inputting. And in this case, for the engineer, it would be essentially, you can go ahead and input maybe your order number, your length, width, height, stuff like that. But if you go up to Pro, for example, that would be information that your customer would be providing. They would essentially go through that online interface like you saw me go through earlier and input all that information. And from there, you assign and build your rules. So rules are essentially the link between your input form and then your captured dimensions or features. So it goes through and takes your input, goes through a rule. You can do mathematical rules, you can do if statements, and then that will essentially go through and drive those dimensions and features. And then from there, you're pretty much done setting it up. What's left to do is just run your project. So you would go through that form that you created, fill out the form, and you can create new variations of models and drawings pretty much over and over again. Once you have that set up, there's really no limitation. You can run it as many times as you want. So this is just to show what the interface looks like. On the left-hand side, that's the kind of master model with on the right-hand side, you have like a pop-up window that has the form in it. You fill out the form and send it off, and you can see on the right-hand side a couple of variations that were created. So maybe you have a taller one, a wider one, narrower. So you're able to see kind of what variations you can create from there. And again, you can create them time and time again. There's really no limitations to how many you can do. As for the training and certification, the training is more or less just watching those videos that we had on our website. But if you were so inclined to want express training for maybe some of your employees, that is something that we would be able to offer. But it's straightforward enough to the point where you can just watch those videos and you'll have a really good idea as to how this works. But more focused on the certification, it is a free certification that's available to all SolidWorks users. And that's something that, it'll give you some new skills you can add to your resume. You can essentially use that maybe even as a base to say, hey, I'm a new employee. You went through that certification so that you can show, you have a good foundational understanding as to how DriveWorks Express works. And to access that, there is a website it's through the DriveWorks website, and you'll see it at the bottom here. So it's DriveWorksXpressCertification.com. One thing to note is that the Express doesn't have an E, so make sure to keep note of that, or you won't end up in the right place. So now I'll actually go through and start the live demo for you guys. So I'll switch over to my SolidWorks interface here. And so what we'll be doing is driving this magazine holder. As you can see, we do have a few cutouts here. So we have 5 in the base model, and then we do have an embossed logo up here for Fisher Unitech. And what we want to do with this project is we want to adjust how many magazines we want to put in this, so it can maybe range from 1 to 8. We want to adjust maybe the width of this, the depth, whether or not we want text, and if we do want text, what that text will be. And I'll be guiding you essentially from the very first step, aside from activation, because I already have mine activated, but essentially starting up DriveWorks Express, capturing your model, your rules, your form, all that stuff. So once you do have your DriveWorks Express wizard activated, if you were to go to the Evaluate tab, you'll see DriveWorks Express wizard over on the right-hand side on the top. So I'll go ahead and kick that off. And I'll create a new database here. I'll go over to my folder where I have my magazine rack files, and I'll create my database. So I'll go ahead and just call this magazine rack. And this creates a Microsoft Access file that keeps track of your project. So from here, if I didn't have my file open already, I can browse for it. But since this is the file that I want to work off of, I'll go ahead and just use this open model. And it'll kick us off straight into the Capture Models tab here. But since I already have this model, and it's essentially captured already since I opened it, I'll go ahead and go to my dimensions and features. So from here, this is where I start to capture all of my features and dimensions. I'll start us off by capturing this text feature, because this is something that I may want to suppress if I don't want text. So I have to capture at the feature level. I'll go ahead and click Add over here on the bottom right. And notice that it just takes the name. This is essentially what DriveWorks will kind of link to. So it'll just be the text. And then from there, I'll go ahead and start adding some dimensions. So I can double click on my base flange here, and you'll see this exposes all my dimensions. I can click on my depth, for example, and since this dimension is named at the SOLIDWORKS level, it automatically populates that name for me. So I'll go ahead and add the depth. Same thing for the width. And then one thing to note is the height is actually being driven by a formula, which has to do with the amount of magazine holders we have. So that we actually won't capture. That gets pretty much automatically updated when we build a rule later on. But from there, we are interested in capturing the magazine quantity. So if I double click on my pattern for my magazine holders, you'll see here I have a 5 that I can click on. Since this is not a named value within SolidWorks, I do have to give it a name. You'll notice I have this kind of yellow warning icon. That's essentially saying that the name cannot be blank. So you have to have some sort of name on here. So I'll go ahead and just say magazine quantity. So go ahead and say add. And so you can keep track of the things that you've captured here. So I've captured that text as a feature, my depth, width, and magazine quantity dimension. Additionally, I can go ahead and capture some custom properties. So if I go down to my custom properties tab, you'll see here any sort of custom property that's within the part will appear here. So I'll go ahead and capture the customer, the custom text, the drawn by, and order number. And so these will ultimately be used within the file itself, but it will also be used in the drawing because the drawing can access these custom properties as well. Okay, so from there, I can go ahead and click on this Drawing and Configurations tab, And what this does is it'll allow you to select your drawing that you want to also capture within your project. So I'll click on this magazine rack drawing. And what that does is whenever I run this project and I make alterations to this part and make new variations, it'll also make a copy of that drawing and update it so that it essentially reflects the changes that I've made to the part. All right, so from there, we pretty much have all of our capturing done. And much like a lot of things in SOLIDWORKS, you work left to right. So now that we're done with capture, we would move over to our form. And we'll start off by creating some text boxes here. So the first one I want to create is a text box for order number. So I'll go ahead here, type in order number. It's a text box. And this required checkbox essentially, kind of like how it says here, is whether or not this is a required field. For the most part, they would be required, but you'll see in a bit that we will have one that isn't required, depending on whether we want text or not. But I'll go ahead and create this order number box, and you'll see here, order number, text box, whether it's required or not, true or false. From there, I'll add another text box here. This would be for our customer. Again, this will be required. Now I'll add a separate type of input here, and this will be a checkbox. And this will be whether or not the custom text is required. So go ahead and say custom text required. And I'll hit create on that. From there, now we want to know, okay, if my text box is required, what kind of text do I want on there? So in this case, I'll go ahead and say custom text for my text box. Now, since this may or may not be used, I'll go ahead and uncheck that required box since, if I don't want to have custom text, then there would be no point of requiring someone to enter custom text. So I'll go ahead and say OK for that. Next, I'll add a spin button here. And so what this does is it'll allow me to choose the quantity of magazines I want. So if I do magazine quantity, like I mentioned before, maybe the minimum value will be 1. Our maximum will be 8. And it'll be in increments of 1. So pretty straightforward, relatively simple here, but it does add that flexibility to show how many magazines we want on there. Okay, and from there now we want to capture or have an input for our captured values for our depth and width. So I'll go ahead and do a numeric text box here. Go ahead and call this depth. It'll be required, and now I can actually enter a minimum and maximum value. So instead of having, the customer or maybe the engineer type in just some arbitrary value, we do want to have a bound to it. So in this case, for the depth, I'll go ahead and set a minimum of 150 and a maximum of 250. And then similarly, for the width, I'll go ahead and do another text box here, numeric text box, with a minimum of 200 and a maximum of 5. So 200, 500, go ahead and click create on there. And then one last control here will actually be a drop-down list. So in this case, it'll be who designed this. So I'll hit designer. And then here, I just have to type out the list. So maybe I'll type in myself, my colleague Aaron, could do Brian, maybe Joe's in here, Krista. So you can go ahead and, continue your list here just by hitting enter, type in whichever names you want. And I'll go ahead and create that as well. So from there, we're pretty much done with the inputs. But if, let's just say, maybe you made these in the wrong order, or you decide after the fact that you want to change the order these are in, you can click on one and then move them up or down with these arrows on the side. But I'll just leave them as is. And what I can do here is test this form. So if I click test, this is what the form will look like pretty much day to day once you're done with the project and you want to enter information. This is what you'll see. By default, everything's pretty much blank. And you'll see here that we do have a yellow warning because this is a required input. If I don't have anything in there, I'll have that warning, and you'll see it's a little kind of orange color. But what I can do here is I can set my defaults. So I'll go ahead and say maybe I'll have 3 digits here, 000. Customer, I'll start with Fisher. We'll say that the custom text is required. Again, maybe I'll do Fisher here. Magazine quantity, the default seems to be 5, so I'll maybe take this up to 5. My depth, I'll go ahead and set those to the minimum since those are the defaults. And designer, choose myself. So if I want these to be my default values whenever I launch this project, at the bottom right, you'll see I have a set defaults button. So I'll go ahead and click that. And now all these values will be set as the defaults. So relatively easy to get that running. So from there, now that we have all of our form inputs done, we'll go over to our rules. And so here you'll see what type of rules we have. So we have file name rules, configurations. In this case, we don't have any. So you'll see we have 0. We did choose a bunch of custom properties. So you'll see we have 4 here, dimensions and features. So you'll see we have a total of 9 different rules that we have to build here. And I'll start us off by going to the file name. So if I choose file name here and click edit rules, you'll see that I have one single part, the magazine rack, and it's asking me when it creates a new variation, how do I want to save this file? I obviously can't just leave it magazine rack because then it'll just keep overwriting the base file. So what I can do here is actually take some of our inputs and build them together to create my file name. So when I click build or I double click on that rule, you'll see I get this rule builder. And it's a very kind of intuitive and helpful builder here, so I can actually choose my inputs and I'll see here what sorts of inputs that I have available. So in this case, I want to build a rule that will essentially put together the order number and customer so that I can go through and say, okay, you know, I have X amount of customer orders, and I can quickly filter through and see which ones I've created. So I'll choose order number here, and you'll see I have a result. Right now it's just 3 zeros because that's my order number default. But to add more text or values into here, I have to use an ampersand. And for example, I'll add a space here, another ampersand, and then I'll go ahead and choose customer. So as you saw a little earlier, if I don't have a proper value, so if I misspelled customer, for example, you'll see that I actually have a red interface and my result will just say name. So that's implying that there's something wrong. Maybe you're missing an ampersand, maybe you're missing a quote mark, or you misspelled something. So in that case, I'll go ahead and fix this. You'll see order number, customer. So in my results, I have 3 zeros and Fisher. Since those are my default values, I'll go ahead and click OK. And you'll see now I have no more missing rules. If I wanted to see existing ones, I can uncheck this button down here in case I wanted to go back and change that, for example. But I'll go back to my summary, and you'll see here now I have one file name rule with none missing, which is exactly what I want to see. Now I'll go into my custom properties. Okay, so from here, some of these are relatively straightforward. So for example, customer, I would just take the customer input and say, okay. So what that does is when I input a customer into that text box, it would essentially drop it into the customer custom property, essentially. So for my custom text, this is where we maybe have to use a little more of an advanced rule. So if I go to my if statement here, and then say for my custom text, I want to say if custom text is required. So that means if that checkbox is marked as true, I'll go ahead and say that my custom text will be the input. If not, I'll leave it blank. So the way these if statements work is the first section before this comma is the essentially the parameter. So whether or not this is met. So if my custom text required is true, which means that box is checked, I'll go ahead and use this first value, which would be my custom text. If it's not checked, then I'll just go ahead and leave that blank by using those 2 quote marks. So go ahead and say OK. Now drawn by, again, this one's relatively straightforward. If I go back and say designer, it'll go ahead and input the designer dropdown into the drawn by list. And last, I'll do order number. I'll go ahead and say order number. Now, let's just say I had forgotten to add maybe one of these custom properties. I can always go back to my capture and then go over to custom properties and say, you know what, actually, I had forgotten my total height. So now I can click my total height, go back to my rules, and you'll see it here. And now I can go ahead and edit my total height. And in this case, we'll actually use kind of a mathematical relation here. So what I want to say here is my total height varies depending on the amount of magazines I have. So I can go ahead and start typing this out. I'll use my magazine quantity. And each of these has roughly 125 millimeters in between as a spacing between each magazine. But I also want to add a little bit of a buffer up top for that text. So I'll go ahead and say magazine quantity times 125 plus 75. And you'll see here my result is 700. So as it is with 5 magazines, my total height is 700. And so what that does is that it essentially puts in that value of 700 into that custom text property, which is then pulled into that dimension at the part level. I could have just made a rule that drove that dimension directly. So you can see there's some flexibility on how you want to do things. There's no one way to do it. It's just a matter of what works best for you. But from there, we're pretty much going back and checking down this list to see what else we have to do. So for my dimensions, these will also be pretty straightforward. If I go ahead and double click on my depth, go back to my inputs, you'll see I have a text input for depth. Same thing for width, double click on that, choose my width. And finally, magazine quantity. I have my magazine quantity number here as well for my input. Now we have one last feature to deal with here as a rule. And this one, again, will actually use a logic if statement. And what I'll do here is for my parameter, I'll say again, that custom text required box. If that is true, then I want to have this, this feature unsuppressed. So if I just do quote, you quote, that means that if I have that checkbox checked, it'll make sure that that feature is unsuppressed and visible. However, if it's not checked, if I do S in between quotes, that'll actually suppress it. So if I don't want to have text, I can have that box unchecked, and this rule will go ahead and suppress that feature from the model itself. So go ahead and say OK. Go back to my summary, and you'll see here now we have a total of 10 rules. None of them are missing. Everything is good to go. So now I can go to my Run button here. And so this is essentially where you'll spend most of your time if you already created your project and you just want to run a couple more variations of it. So for example, I'll go ahead and say 001. Customer, I'll leave as Fisher. I'll leave my custom text required. My custom text will be Fisher again. And let's just say I want to go up to 7 magazines now. I'll increase the depth a little bit up to 200. And my width as well, I'll increase. And notice if I hover over, it'll actually tell me, type in a number, a numeric value for width between 200 and 500. So that, it's a useful thing to have there so you can keep track of what your bounds are. So maybe I'll crank it up to 300. Designer, so you can see here I have my drop down. I'll go ahead and just stick with my own designer name. Click create on the bottom right. And you'll see DriveWorks essentially go through and make those changes for you. And so something to note is over on the right-hand side, you kind of see what it's doing step by step. So you'll see here that it essentially creates a new file. It opens it. It changes the customer to Fisher, drawn by it at me, changes those dimension values. It suppresses the text or unsuppresses the text and goes through and makes some drawing changes. Now, if you ever have some issues where maybe something isn't happening correctly, you'd be able to kind of debug that through here. For instance, if maybe you mistyped one of your dimensions or maybe somewhere down the line you made a change that kind of conflicted with something else, you'll see on here step by step what happened. But as you can see here, we do have 7 magazine holders. That name changed to Fisher. And if I check my size here, you'll see that it updated to 200 and 300 respectively. And you'll also notice that the height also changed. So it used to be 700, now it's 950, and again, that's driven by that custom property that we created a rule for. Now, if I go and open this drawing, you'll start to see one of the limitations of Express specifically. So at first glance, you might say this looks good, right? So all of my dimensions are in place, everything is more or less spaced relatively well. But if you kind of take a closer look, you'll notice that these two extra magazine holders don't have dimensions on them. That's because the master drawing was based off of a model with only 5. So once that pattern added 2 more, there's no way to really implement more dimensions on there with Express anyways. That is something that you would be able to handle with SOLIDWORKS Pro. But another thing to note here as well is if I go back just to show a little more of the functionality of this, I'll create another order number customer. Let's just say it's me, and I don't want any text. I want mine to be nice and sleek with no text up top. So in this case, I could just leave this as Fisher. It won't really use it, but if I wanted to, I could delete it. And now I actually want it to be relatively small. I don't have a lot of magazines, so I'll just say 2. And I'll keep those same default depth and widths. Go ahead and say create. And this will show a little bit more of those limitations as well, specifically at the drawing level. So I'll go ahead and let this finish up. And you'll see here, now I have no text. I still have that feature, right? So still here, that text feature still exists. It just suppresses it based on that rule that I made earlier. And now I have my 2 magazine holders. And you can see here, everything was successfully created. However, if I go back and look at that drawing, you'll see here now that I actually have less than the original, I have some dangling dimensions, right? So all of these dimensions used to be pointing to an existing holder, but now that they're gone, they don't really know what to refer to anymore. You know, I can go ahead and delete these, that's not a problem. But again, because this is Express, it'll get you most of the way there, and you might just have to do a little bit more tweaking at the drawing level. However, if you were using Pro, there is functionality in there that says if there's any dangling dimensions, just delete them for me. And then you wouldn't even have to touch this drawing. Something else to note here is that this drawing is pulling in those custom properties. So you'll see here, I can keep track of the height, width, and depth. You'll see here my order number, 002 Atom. And so that's one reason why you would want to drive custom properties. So you'll be able to use them either at the drawing level or at your part level. Okay, so that is more or less what I wanted to show you for the part anyways. I do want to show you a little bit more when it comes to working with an assembly. So I'll go ahead and open up another assembly here. And so this is actually, a very simple project here. I just have a base block in the middle, a block on the right, and a block on the left. Nothing too crazy here. But just to show you guys a little bit of working in assemblies, this block does have a few configurations. So each of these 3 blocks has a blue configuration, a green, a gray, and a red. And all that really does is I just change the appearance. But obviously, if you wanted to either implement more dimensional changes or features, you're able to do that. But just for the simplicity and to kind of show you how to work with assemblies, all I did was made a couple configurations, each of which have a different color. But what I'll show you guys here is I did already make a project for this. So I'll go ahead and change my database. So you'll see here that I do have my magazine project. So if I wanted to go back and work on that, I can open it. But otherwise, I'll go to my blocks folder, and I have another project there. I'll go ahead and open that. Now, if I go to, let's see, use my, okay. So if I go back to run this project, you'll see here the relatively simple interface. I just have an order number, my customer, 2 checkboxes to see whether or not the left block or right block are required, and then a bunch of drop-downs for color. So in the background, what's happening is these 2 check marks are being used as an input to tell DriveWorks whether or not to delete or keep that file. So as it is now, I'll be keeping both of the blocks, And let's just say, I want to add a little bit of color here. So I'll change my left, base, and right colors. And now remember that this is actually changing the configuration itself. So don't just think, oh, this is just changing the color. This is actually going through and changing a configuration of each of these parts. So I'll go ahead and say maybe order number 001, customer Fisher. I'll go ahead and create this. It'll go through, make a copy of each of those files, make a copy of the assembly, change to the appropriate configuration, and then it'll go ahead and rebuild. And again, I can go here and review, okay, each of these parts was created properly, the assembly was created, each of the configurations was properly set. And you can see here I have all three of my blocks, each of them in the color that I chose. And again, those are configurations, right? So if I go ahead and go back to this and say, maybe this time I don't want a left block, I'll go ahead and uncheck that. I don't really have to choose a color. By default, they're gray for the left, but I can just leave that as is. And maybe I want both of these to be red now. So I'll go ahead and click create. And what this will do is it'll see that the checkbox for the left box is not checked. And it'll say, okay, go ahead and delete that file. And now I have both of these red. So how I'm able to do that is at the capture level here, when I go to my assembly structure. Let's see, yeah, I'm getting some issues coming up here. I would be able to see that I have those three models captured. And under the Drawings and Configurations tab, let's see, I would be able to choose, yes, allow me to create a rule to switch configurations. And so what that'll do is it'll actually populate this configurations rule. Because mind you, for the first project that we went through, we didn't really have any here because there was no configurations to change. But in this case, I did set configurations for those three blocks. And you'll see here, my left, base, and right blocks. And so if I go in here, you'll see here that the configuration name will be essentially given by the left color input. And in that case, those inputs were simply, red, green, and blue. So it'll say, okay, I want the red configuration based off of this input. I'll go to the part level, switch over to that configuration. So that's how it changes configurations. However, for file names, this is how you're able to get rid of parts you don't want. So for example, in this left block again, I just use a simple if statement that says if the left block, which is the checkbox, is true, which means it's checked, go ahead and give it an order number and customer for its name like we did before. Otherwise, if it's unchecked, go ahead and just delete it. And I simply do delete in quotes, and it'll go through and say, okay, it's not checked. Get rid of that file. That way you can keep your assembly, at a smaller level. I could have suppressed it if I wanted to, but typically, if you don't need a part, you can delete it, and it'll save you some file space, and it'll perform a bit better when you're rebuilding and essentially working on that file. But yeah, from there, that pretty much concludes the demo portion of this project, of this webinar. But I do have a bit more information to give you guys. So Fisher does provide quite a few services when it comes to DriveWorks, and here's a relatively expansive list as to what you can expect. If you wanted to ask any questions about this, we do have Aaron Winthers on the line as well. He's our design automation specialist. So if you see anything here that might, chime in with what you're looking for, you can always have a conversation with him, and he can definitely help you out with any of these services. But to quickly summarize what we covered here, we went over what is DriveWorks, different resources and activation help for DriveWorksXpress specifically. We went over how Express works, in addition to the associate certification, which again is free and available to anyone who has access to SolidWorks and DriveWorksXpress. We went over a live demo covering a part and how you can configure that part and vary it depending on your inputs. And we also covered an assembly and how you can change configurations and maybe even delete or change file names based on your inputs. And we rounded out by talking a bit about the services that Fisher provides. And so thank you, everyone. This concludes the demo portion of our webcast.